In 3,000 years or so, scholars would call it a theophany. It's a Latin word that comes from the ancient Greek word theophania, which means roughly what just happened. Theophany means a visible manifestation of God. But right here, right now, standing at the foot of some unnamed mountain, watching the top of the mountain burn like fire and seeing this column of smoke just going shooting up from the mountaintop, standing there like a pillar that's holding up the sky, feeling the ground tremble with this deep bass sound that just reaches inside your chest and plucks at your ribs like heartstrings. And then hearing the unmistakable voice of Yahweh forming words from thunder. You would just call it terrifying. You would say it was the most awe-inspiring and blood-chilling moment of your life. And when Moses finally turned to you and warned you not to approach any closer to the mountain, it was all you could do not to laugh in his face, because that was the last thing on your mind. And then you watched Moses as he ascended the mountain. He disappeared into the smoke, leaving you to ponder what you've just heard. In a journey of some 3 months that had been punctuated by defining moments, this was something else. This was 3 months or so after the battle of wills between Moses and Pharaoh culminated in you gaining your freedom. It was some 3 months after you took the gamble and you stood up and you identified yourself as a Hebrew by painting your doorway. You stood up along with your friends and your neighbors and your brothers and your sisters, and you said, "We are Hebrews and we need to be free." And there were the miracles at Yam Suf, the Red Sea, and at Mara, where you suddenly had sweet water where it had been bitter before. And that great miracle of bread from the sky that still sustains you today. After all of these miracles, today, that moment when you heard God speaking, and you heard the voice of Yahweh and the thunder, that was the moment when He told you what the bill was going to be for all of that. Because that was the moment when Yahweh told you what it would mean to be a child of Israel, a free Hebrew, one of the chosen people. This was the moment when the law was laid down and the expectations were set. Yahweh had long ago made a covenant with Abraham, and now the covenant was passed down to you and your people. And you knew it was not unusual for a covenant between tribes to have stipulations set down, sort of like we have in modern days with treaties. So the idea of these rules, what we would go on to call the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue, it was not unheard of, but to actually be there and hear them come from the lips of Yahweh was something special. And the fact that these expectations were laid down and they're still part of our culture 3,500 years later, that's pretty remarkable too. Now, tradition holds that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, what we call the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now that tradition is somewhat problematic as you study the Bible. problematic first because the death and burial of Moses are described within those books, so it's kind of hard for him to write about it. And scholars know that there are other difficulties because written Hebrew was not around at the time of Moses, and it wasn't even invented in primitive form until several hundred years later. But what scholars have learned is that Exodus and the other books were probably written down in present form about 700 or 800 years after the events occurred, inspired by the Holy Spirit. And written down, these were records of oral history, oral traditions that the people had. And the authors were inspired by God to write them down, and they were inspired to stitch together these narratives using different sources, possibly even different written sources. And that's why sometimes you'll see, if you read carefully, that different stories within the Pentateuch are repeated. We're not going to go off down that rabbit hole, but Genesis, for instance, has 2 stories of creation, and they're put very close together because there were 2 oral traditions that were written down. But the important thing to know is that the authors, whoever they were inspired by the Holy Spirit, and that the events of that day were important enough, and the words were important enough to be written down in sacred text and preserved for thousands of years. These are the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, the 10 words. They're the basis of Hebrew culture, and they would go on to be, as I said, a major influence on Western civilization as well. And we all know them, right? You shall have no other gods before me. Interestingly, Yahweh does not say that there aren't any other gods. He just says, you don't worship them. You worship me. You shall have no idols. You shall not take God's name in vain. You shall keep the Sabbath. You shall honor your parents. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's stuff or your neighbor. And when you think about it, when you think about those simple rules, God really wasn't setting the bar too high, was he? When you think about it, God was just asking us to do some very simple things. It's simple enough that Jesus summed it all up in 2 commandments. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. That was the first part of the commandments, the first set. And then the rest of the commandments are love your neighbor as you love yourself. Treat other people with respect. Treat other people the way you would like to be treated. So God is not exactly asking the world of us. And why do we have such a hard time? Why do we have such a hard time obeying Him? Why do we persist in finding other idols to worship? Money, or power, or celebrity, even ourselves. Why do we persist in destructive and self-destructive behaviors that put us at odds with the commandments one way or another? And make no mistake, we all do that. Because Jesus made it clear that it's what we feel in our heart and not necessarily what we do with our hands that counts. So if we hate, it's as good as murder. If we lust, it's as good as adultery. If we put something, anything, ahead of God in our lives, that's as good as worshiping an idol. My goodness, we're really good at doing that, aren't we? The truth is, If you don't have God at the center of your life, then something else is. I'll repeat that. If you don't have God at the center of your life, then something else is at the center. What is it? Because that might be what's holding you back from accepting the grace of God and from turning back toward God instead of away. I want to widen that out just a little bit. I'll say that if God is not at the center of what we do as a church, then something else is. If God is not at the center of what we do as a church, then something else is distracting us. Something else is standing between us and our mission as messengers of the great good news of the gospel. What might that be? I'll widen it out just a little bit more. If these simple commandments from God, these 10 simple rules for being human, are not at the center of our culture, they're not at the center of our civilization, then something else is. And if something else other than those are at the center of our society, what does that mean for us? Where are we destined? Now on the flip side, I'm just asking. Just asking, what would happen, do you think, if we started living our lives as though they were at the center? What would happen if we started living our lives as though the 10 Commandments really were at the center of our life, as though God really was the center of our life? Now, we cannot force other people to live by those rules. That's not what it's about. God doesn't even try to force us to live by those rules. He sets them. He shows us, but He doesn't force us. But if we did live as though those were the center, then we could start to show people what it's like. We could show them what it's like to honor God. We could show them what it is like to honor each other and to treat one another with love and respect. Couldn't we? We could show them what a God-centered, people-serving life looked like. We could show them what a God-centered, people-serving, people-loving church is. What do you suppose that would look like? If every person who professed faith in God actually strove to follow these commandments. If every person who professed to love Jesus actually lived according to His teachings, what kind of world would we have? Not the one we have now. But we could start. As individuals, we could start. As a church, we could start. And then what would we have? And maybe it's just fantasy to think that. Maybe it's just foolishness. Maybe it's time we tried to find out. See what kind of world